Someone basically upon my mission, endless silence with stigma and shame about suicide loss, ideation, and mental health. Please, won't you join me? Welcome to Suicide Zen Forgiveness, the podcast that shares powerful stories of suicide loss, ideation, and mental health in order to break the silent stigma and shame. Our mission is to encourage empathy for those experiencing these challenges. Every narrative serves as a beacon of hope on to touch lives and inspire resilience. Won't you join me in this journey as we share stories to help others to find hope? Please note, this podcast is for educational purposes and may contain triggering content. If you're grieving or experiencing mental health issues, please reach out to your local suicide hotline or mental health office for immediate help. And now, let's start the show. My first guest in the new series is David Amerland. David Amerland has written a whole lot of books, many on search engine optimization. In the last few years, they've concentrated much more on human designs. And the fact is, he is currently working on a new book. He himself says he can't tell you what it's about just yet, but he is currently sharing snippets of what he gleans as he writes. He wrote a really important post in September, and I'm going to read it to you because I think it says more about David than anything I could say. Intelligence, we used to believe, required knowledge, but that's not the case. If you somehow manage to store all of the world's information inside your head, all of it, you wouldn't necessarily be any smarter. You'd just be more knowledgeable. What truly makes us smart, both inside our head and outside it, is the ability to transfer the knowledge and experience we have to novel context we haven't encountered before. We don't need to touch a hot iron to know we'll be burned. We've all been burnt by something hot we touched at some point in the past, and the experience taught us that anything hot will burn us, even if we encounter it in an entirely different place and time, and it happens to have a completely different size and shape. The transfer of knowledge from one context to another happens via connection. Inside our head, these are neurons, each of which has anywhere between 6,000 and 10,000 synapses, which weave a complex interactive web with the synapses of neighboring neurons. Our brain is complex because it has approximately 86 million neurons, which form approximately, again, 100 trillion connections. Similarly, in the real world, we form connections to other people. We learn from their experiences, imbibe in the ideas they share, take part in their online and offline conversations, and we dive into their wealth of knowledge and experience, and hopefully reciprocating kind and openly and generously share ours. It is this connection that allows us to grow exponentially in our knowledge and skill and become more efficient and more productive. In the offline world, psychologists call this the water cooler effect, and they find it leads to increased cohesion among groups and increased productivity. At this moment, we're finding that there is a great deal of division among peoples. And that's, again, why we're doing this series. David has a wealth of knowledge, and more importantly, he's made the connections in order to comprehend the intellectual bits that we all need to learn about. And with that said, I am so excited to bring him up to the stage. Join me in welcoming David Amerland. Thank you for joining me, David.
It's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm so excited to have you because I believe that navigating where we go from here, it's a whole new ball game.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
We are not. It's not. We have never been. I say this, and I know you're going to correct me on it because it's not really true. But for those of us that are alive today, it feels like we have never been here before. Never have people been so divided. Never have people been so at odds with what's happening among themselves, in their government, in their commerce. All over the world, it seems that we are in and out of conflict on a daily basis. And a lot of people say they don't even want to turn on the news because they cannot believe what it is they're hearing. I approached you because I knew that of all the people I could think of, you would look at it and give us a much deeper look into what's actually happening. And I know you offer hope for where we can go from here.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And it's funny how you said I'm going to correct you now. I'm not really going to correct you, but I'm going to say, like the 70s, right? Only a little bit more. We have 70s, right? We had job insecurity, we had fuel crisis because OPEC at the time cut back, throttled back fuel or oil production, and the fuel skyrocketed. We had rampant inflation across the world. The money markets were going up and down. We had East and West at odds with each other. We had the Iron Curtain. We had America and Russia at each other's throats. We had the Middle East. We had the Suez crisis. We've had right. Yeah, we had that. We had terrorism across the world, and the Israeli and Palestinian conflict was still going on in some form with Arafat and the PLO. All those things have come back to haunt us, right? Like fashions. I look at fashion choices today. It's like I'm growing up again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
It's most, and I think we need to address this a little bit before we move forward, a little bit more concisely. Why is it happening? And it's the old adage about history repeating itself, but not quite the same time. So there's a cyclical sort of thing in the way that people behave. And essentially, history is human behavior. Human behavior is driven by experiences, by knowledge, and by memory. And it's no coincidence that in the 21st century, there are very few people alive who remember anything about the crisis of the Second World War, or even perhaps what the 70s were like, because they didn't really experience it. And because we don't remember that, our choices and our actions are reflective of mistakes, perhaps, or assumptions that were in effect before those things happened. And I know this sounds dismal now, right? It sounds like we never learned, but this is not true. We may make similar mistakes, but we progress. We have different tools at our disposal. Case in point, this podcast. We have different ways of connecting to each other, have different ways of discovering what is our next step and how we should act. We have different ways of shaping how we develop, how we think, how we learn to maintain hope when everything else seems to be hopeless and helpless. And it's not, but that's what it feels like at times. So I think can understand why we see these things, why we experience them now. It doesn't help us very much right now, but the moment we realize that it's part of human behavior, then we also say, what has changed? What is different? Some things aren't, but is it really as bad as it seems? And the answer is no, it isn't. Why isn't it? Let's start with the elections in the US, because that's a thing, the key thing in most people's minds, right? As we head towards 2025, we're going to have a Trump administration that's going to be probably as bad as we probably can think it's going to be. They're going to be 4 years which are going to be chaotic as we probably imagine they will be. And we feel helpless and hopeless, and we feel lost, and we feel perhaps a certain amount of desperation and anger. Let's unpack all that now. Why do we feel angry? Anger is an emotion that we experience when something which we want to happen hasn't happened, or somebody hasn't behaved the way that we expect them to behave, or a particular expectation hasn't been met. The moment we realize that, of course, we realize how silly perhaps it is. We feel angry at something which we don't necessarily control. We don't control the world. We don't control other people. We don't control the weather. We don't control politics. It's not our job to shape anything. That doesn't mean we're helpless. On the contrary, and I'll get to that. But that's why we feel anger. We feel despair and helplessness because, again, we feel too small to move the needle forward. And in truth, we are. An individual person can't really do very much. It's not really our job to do that. We're all trying to survive. We're all trying to maintain our own inner equilibrium against the everyday friction we encounter. So then on top of that, we have to think, okay, what is right for the world? What is right for these things to happen? What can we do in that kind of context? And if we think about that, then we realize that perhaps there isn't very much we can do. But actually, again, this is wrong. There is a lot we can do. And I'll again explain how and why. And we feel perhaps help and despair because we feel that the things we believe in aren't happening. We don't get to have a happy ending. We don't get to feel that the good guys won. We don't get to feel that right is not might. All the things that Camelot taught us, right? And again, this is wrong, okay? Because there are a lot more decent people in the world than the opposite. There are a lot more people who are committed to these ideals than the opposite. And it may not be reflective of the current reality, but there are reasons for that, which I'll touch on in a moment.
I have
So,
a question. Yeah, before you go any further, because I think this may have a lot to do with everything feels more, the word I want to use is immediate. But what I mean is with this technology, with the fact that we have podcasts and satellites and televisions and everything, there is no waiting period. In the 70s, it could take a few days before you learned of what was happening on the other side of the world. It could take a little more time to understand that there were earthquakes or wars or what have you. It was not immediate, but almost in the second that something happens, a rocket is launched or people go to war or there's an earthquake, it has been transmitted around the world and we are being bombarded moment by moment, almost in real time. Does that have some bearing on how much angst there is, how much anger, how much despair?
absolutely, I'm very glad you brought this up. Now, we have evolved to have a very high threat detection mechanism in our brain because that's how we survive. And this is survival bias. The ones who survive to pass on their genes through the ages are the ones who are very good at detecting threat, filtering out from the information, filtering out from the environment around them, and acting on it. So let's say we take an average individual living perhaps in the States or living in Britain or living in any other country, and they get news from across the globe that are frightening, they are horrific perhaps. It's a kind of information that we absorb. We try to put in some kind of context. It arouses our internal world because we process it. Our threat detection mechanisms are activated. And then we think we need to act on it. And how are we going to act against perhaps, I don't know, corruption in one of the South African countries? And a massive earthquake that happened because of shoddy building materials, I don't know, perhaps in China. Massive earthquakes or massive natural disasters that nobody did anything to prepare for because they couldn't care less. And we can't. And what happens in that situation goes into increasing the worldview we hold as being inherently unstable, which then makes us feel unsafe, which then makes us come out of our own house in a heightened state of arousal, prepared to pretty much be aggressive towards everybody because we feel threatened. And this is an unspecified, unnamed threat which haven't been able to contextualize and deal with. And this is understandable. If we sit down and think about it and analyze it in ourselves, we'll say, okay, this is ridiculous. Okay, it's bad that this is happening. I agree. Nobody should have to go through that, whatever that bad thing is. At the same time, it doesn't impact on my everyday reality. And that doesn't mean I'm insensitive to it, but it means that, hey, I still have a job to do. I still have to be nice to the people around me. I still have to have the head space to deal with anything which is unexpected, process that, and actually respond to that in a manner that is reasonable and, if possibly, kind. If we constantly live in a state of arousal, we're exhausted before we even leave our homes. Suddenly we get to work and we're going to be exhausted by work, bombarded by whatever it gives us. We're going to be bombarded by the unexpected twists and turns of life itself. And then we're expected to go back home. And in all that time in between, we're consuming social media from across the world that is usually bleak, because bleak news travels fast. Nobody's going to tell you something. It's great news because great news is local. It only impacts people locally. If I tell whatever, my next door neighbor saved 3 kittens from death and he's adopted them and he's feeding them and they're amazing. Okay, this is great. It makes me feel good. It makes him feel good. It makes the people around him who see that feel good. But it doesn't travel around the world because this is local. If something happens which is bad, it may be local, but it goes global very quickly. Yeah. We are hardwired to see these threats, to actually magnify them and project them, in our head, because again, that's how we survive. So our inner survival mechanism makes it possible for us to see these things and think we need to take some kind of action, which we can't. So we end up living in a state of arousal, which is never really dissipated. So we're constantly perhaps fearful and angry. So it's a modern ill, perhaps. And I use the word ill in a sort of very generic way. I don't specifically target social media. This is one mechanism. Technology is another. The amount of information we have to process on a daily basis is a third. All these things are pluses, and at the same time, they're minuses. And right now, the minuses are accruing, and the pluses are not very evident, but they exist. Okay, let's make no mistake. So I'm not advocating let's take things back. No. But we need to find a way forward. So we keep this in mind on your question. So this is like a kind of picture we live in right now. We live in a world that appears very bleak. Anything that's big travels fast. Anything that's bad travels very quickly. Anything that's false and sensational can take off before we even have time to process it. We know that information that's spread very quickly gains validity on its own, in its own right. And then it's very hard to combat because we have to really think about it. Thinking about it, analyzing, doing our own research from credible sources is energetically exhausting. We're already exhausted by everyday life right now. Everybody's really tired and nobody has time to do anything. So we tend to accept things are bad. We're all going to die. We can't do very much about anything. And like I said, the truth is not like that. So let's break all these things down and say, okay, what can we do? Let's go on the bright side of this. First of all, what have we always done? Whenever we have had crises in the past, the crises tend to be local, mostly because you feel them. We find strength in those around us and the communities we're at. In order for usually that happens because we tend to share the same experience, which drives us together. Traditionally, this ability to unify has always been our super strength. Our superpower is that we can basically get together and be more together than we can be alone. How do we do that on a daily basis now? Here, when everybody's around us is afraid, they are on edge, they overreact to things. If we manage to be stable in ourselves, and in order to do that, we need to process where our fear is coming from. We need to actually externalize it and articulate it. And if you say to yourself, what am I really afraid of? And when you think about it, and your life hasn't materially changed in the last few years, despite all the changes in the world, despite all the bad things, then your fear is something nebulous, something you can't really articulate, but it's there. You feel it. I don't disagree. We're designed to feel it. But at the same time, in a modern setting, we are capable of standing back, taking it out of ourselves, seeing it, recognizing it, and analyzing it. And the moment we do that, this nebulous fear tends to disappear. It dissipates. We say, okay, I'm worried the state of the world is bad and we're all going to die. And then you ask yourself, can I do anything really realistically about that? Do I run a country? Do I possess a military? Have I got access to, I don't know, super powerful technology that can make everybody pay attention to me? No, I haven't. So, hey, what's my superpower? I can smile. Huh. Makes me feel better. Makes the people around me feel better. And if I feel better and the people around me feel better, we behave better. And if we behave better, the world can't be a terrible place, really. Sure, bad things happen, but bad things happen all the time. So this is a small strategy that has a very deep long-term effect. It doesn't take much. It takes a little bit of take a step back, take a deep breath, articulate what it is that you're actually worried about. Think about it. Is it real? If it isn't real, then you can act accordingly. You acknowledge it, you know it's there, you know its sources, you don't discount them, you don't negate other people's pain or other people's problems. No, they're there. But at the same time, you don't have to be paralyzed. You don't have to be angry to the point that you overreact. You don't have to be fearful to the point that you're constantly on edge and exhausted, because you're not helping anybody in that state. So this is the primary survival strategy of the individual. If you have more in your tank and you say, perhaps I can do a little bit more, what can I do? Then we just take another step and you say, okay, how do you behave around friends, family, workmates, in your workplace? Do you try and be a beacon of, or a paragon of hope? You say, how do I do that? How about being kind to people? You don't have to do anything super strategic. Somebody makes a mistake, say, let's see how we can fix it, instead of, why did you make that mistake? And creating a blame culture. And it's a natural reaction if we're on edge, because we're removing blame for ourselves. And we are essentially setting somebody else who's going to be blamed. They will see that as a cathartic effect. And the problem is solved because it's not us, it's them, and we fixed it. But if we say, how can we make sure this didn't happen? Or if something is complex and you ask somebody for help and you do things together. Or if you offer help, you say, I've got this spare time. Can I help? I've got this spare capacity. Can I help? You see somebody struggling, offer to help. Now, these are small acts of kindness that, in an unseen way, move the needle to where it should be moved. Why? Because somebody feels that. They feel that the load is taken off them. They feel somebody actually cares. They feel they're not alone, struggling on their own. And everybody struggles in some way, both internally and externally. So this is the next thing you can do. And then we get to other things where you get together and organize in small ways in your communities, in your workplace, in your organizations you want to organize at or in. And you say, what can we do to help? And these three things collectively, if we all do them, suddenly begin to move everything to the place that it should be moved at.
You make it sound so simple. And I understand in a way it is. But as humans, part of our internal process, when we are fearful, when we get bad news, all of those things, that flood of hormones that take over inside, that fuel the rage and the despair and the angst, it's hard sometimes to get a handle on the interior of you. And I think that in and of itself is also a big problem. And I know particularly airlines and airports and restaurants, since COVID, okay, people have not seen the level and the multitude of bad behavior that just seems to explode everywhere. And on the littlest provocation, it sometimes You see the news and wonder, what is it that's making everyone so angry? Partly, I think you're explaining it, being immersed in, I'm going to call it bad energy, but everything from the sickness, from COVID to not just the politics, it's the climate, it's climate change. Whether you believe it or not, okay, the fires and the tsunamis and the earthquakes and the blizzards and the hurricanes that are happening all over, that you have to take notice. They keep happening. And I think it's got to be terrifying for people who live like in what is it, Tornado Alley, and the people in the Caribbean and the people in the Philippines and all around those areas that go through this yearly. Okay, it's not a one-off. Some of us here in Ottawa, a number of years ago, we went through a series of tornadoes like we have never seen. It flattened an entire area. And it's not something that our climate, we're fairly northerly climate, it's not something we see with any regularity. But now that it's happened, you hear people here talking about the fact that when they see these things on the news now about tornadoes and earthquakes and what have you, there is that much deeper fear. It is hormonal as well because you've experienced it now. And it's something that it's one thing, I think, to see something happen on the other side of the world, like a tsunami or a massive earthquake that you have never experienced. When you experience something like that, the whole concept of the fear and what have you is heightened so much. What suggestions do you have for people to be able to maybe make a little sense of it and give themselves a couple of tools they can use to not be walking around in cortisol soup all the time? That would be very helpful.
Very good indeed. Okay, so let's explain a little bit of the state we walk in when we experience what you just said. Now, when we experience the fury of nature, we truly feel powerless because it is simply so vast. I think the last cyclone that hit the California, I think was, and they're worried about it, collectively had the power of 1,000 nuclear bombs. It's mind-boggling. We say it to ourselves and we think, sure, but how? And when you realize that nature actually has a kind of power, no matter what we can do, it just isn't enough. And somebody said, and one of my friends said, why don't we nuke it? Because that will break it up. And I said, collectively, it has 1,000 nuclear bombs. So we need to use something more than that, bigger than that. If we use something bigger than that, we pretty much devastate a massive amount of area on our planet, including the planet and the global climate. So we haven't solved anything. And he thought, how can he have that kind of power? It's a massive natural phenomenon. It's a planetary phenomenon. And the planet is however small our planet is, it's vast compared to what we experience. And the power that it has is incredible. So when we experience any kind of weather phenomenon, we feel fairly helpless. And when we feel helpless and we don't like that feeling, we tend to do one of two things. One is we deny things. We say, oh, it's not bad, or it's going to be okay, even though we know it isn't. Or it's not what everybody says it is, it's going to pass by, or it's going to go, or it's one off. The other thing which we do is that we tend to feel angry. And why do we feel angry? Because the weather tends to make us feel like a victim. In that situation, in context, the anger response allows us to turn the victimhood which we feel, which essentially creates a toxic environment inside us, which affects in our internal organs, which is why we feel so bad when somebody victimizes us. If somebody bullies us day after day, we're going to get ill. And they can bully us verbally, no touching. How are we going to get ill? Because cortisol levels rise in our system, toxicity begins to increase in around our vital organs, and we begin to malfunction physically. And nobody has touched us. Nobody has said anything too aggressive. They just bullied us. They made us feel bad. So whenever we feel bad internally, our chemistry changes in a way that's actually toxic for us. Whenever we feel good, it's the opposite. When we get angry, however, we reverse the toxicity. And that allows us to respond externally and minimize the pressure that we feel internally. This is why, for instance, if anybody has felt that, if, let's say, you hit your head against a cupboard and the cupboard door is open, your first response is to slap it.
Yeah, he's angry.
Or kick it, right? It's ridiculous. Yeah. What have we done in that context? We essentially gave human agency to the inanimate object, and we said it hurt us, and we're going to hurt it back, and that's it. It's great because now we have the upper hand again. All we have felt is sudden, unexpected pain through a stupidity of ours because we didn't map the external environment sufficiently to navigate in a safe way. So it's no different when we feel we're being victimized by a situation we can't control. In order to gain that sense of control, which we need in order to function, we have that anger inside us, which then needs to be externalized because anger that isn't externalized is also bad for us. That leads us to why you experience the things which you said you experience. Okay, you experience kind of bad behavior, you experience people who are on edge, people who behave aggressively, people who are no longer inclined to be kind and accepting because they don't feel that way. How do we deal with it? This is where the smart part of us comes into effect. This is not the 10th century anymore. We understand where these emotions come from. We understand the triggers that bring them about. We understand how they make us feel. And now we know that, hey, we live in a civilized world. We need to be able to deal with it as adults, not children. And we need to be able to externalize those feelings. We can say, hey, this thing makes me feel helpless and scared. The moment you articulate it, you have actually gained your agency back. You have gained a sense of control. If you share it with somebody and that other person says, yeah, I feel the same way. Well, relief. You're not alone. You're not the only person feeling victimized by this. Being able to actually open up instead of keeping these things inside makes it a lot less likely that we're going to explode because it gets bottled up to the point where we cannot control it any longer. So that's one strategy. But sometimes people can't open up. They're not able to connect with other people, and you're absolutely alone, which is in a bad situation to be in, but it happens, and we know that loneliness is an epidemic across the world. In that case, what can you do? Even in that, we actually have tools at our disposal.
Be sure and join us again next time when we dive into the tools and other things we can do to stem this epidemic of loneliness.
Thank you for being here for another inspiring episode of Suicide Zen Forgiveness. We appreciate you tuning in. Please subscribe and download on your favorite service and check out SZF's YouTube channel or Facebook community. If you have the chance to leave a 5-star rating or review, it'd be greatly appreciated. Please refer this to a friend you know who may benefit from the hope and inspiration from our guests. Suicide Zen Forgiveness was brought to you by the following sponsors. Truel Social Media, the digital integration specialists. Let them get you rocking page 1 in the search results. Canada's keynote humorist Judy Croon, motivational speaker, comedian, author, and stand-up coach at Second City, Judy has been involved for over a decade in the City Street Outreach Program in Toronto.
The ultimate podcasting path. This is great for you if you're just starting your podcast or if you've been running it for a while. It's filled with tools, templates, and training for starting, growing, and monetizing your podcast. Get access to time-saving systems and strategies for accelerating your process at each step. Find new connections and collaborations in the uplifting podcasting community. I look forward to seeing you there.
Do you have a story to share? Do you know someone you think would be a great guest? Please go to szf42.com. And for our American listeners, that's szf42.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again.
And
Wasting no time.